The Pavilion on the Links by Robert Louis Stevenson. Part 2. I returned to the den to cook myself a meal, of which I stood in great need, as well as to care for my horse, whom I had somewhat neglected in the morning. From time to time I went down to the edge of the wood, but there was no change in the pavilion, and not a human creature was seen all day upon the links. The schooner in the offing was the one touch of life within my range of vision. She, apparently with no set object, stood off and on or later, hour after hour, but as the evening deepened, she drew steadily nearer. I became more convinced that she carried Northmore and his friends, and that they would probably come ashore after dark, not only because that was of a piece with the secrecy of the preparations, but because the tide would not have flowed sufficiently before 11 to cover Graden Floe and the other sea quags that fortified the shore against invaders. All day the wind had been going down, and the sea along with it, but there was a return toward sunset of the heavy weather of the day before. The night set in pitch dark. The wind came off the sea in squalls, like the firing of a battery of cannon. Now and then there was a flaw of rain, and the surf rolled heavier with the rising tide. I was down at my observatory among the elders when a light was run up to the masthead of the schooner, and showed she was closer in than when I had last seen her by the dying daylight. I concluded that this must be a signal to Northmore's associates on shore, and, stepping forth into the links, looked around me for something in response. A small footpath ran along the margin of the wood, and formed the most direct communication between the pavilion and the mansion house, and, as I cast my eyes to that side, I saw a spark of light, not a quarter of a mile away, and rapidly approaching. From its uneven course it appeared to be the light of a lantern carried by a person who followed the windings of the path, and was often staggered and taken aback by the more violent squalls. I concealed myself once more among the elders, and waited eagerly for the newcomer's advance. It proved to be a woman, and, as she passed within half a rod of my ambush, I was able to recognize the features. The deaf and silent old dame, who had nursed Northmore in his childhood, was his associate in this underhand affair. I followed her at a little distance, taking advantage of the innumerable heights and hollows concealed by the darkness, and favored not only by the nurse's deafness, but by the uproar of the wind and surf. She entered the pavilion, and, going at once to the upper story, opened and set a light in one of the windows that looked toward the sea. Immediately afterwards the light at the schooner's masthead was run down and extinguished. Its purpose had been attained, and those on board were sure that they were expected. The old woman resumed her preparations. Although the other shutters remained closed, I could see a glimmer going to and fro about the house, and a gush of sparks from one chimney after another soon told me that the fires were being kindled. Northmore and his guests, I was now persuaded, would come ashore as soon as there was water on the floe. It was a wild night for boat service, and I felt some alarm mingle with my curiosity as I reflected on the danger of the landing. My old acquaintance, it was true, was the most eccentric of men, but the present eccentricity was both disquieting and lugubrious to consider. A variety of feelings thus led me toward the beach, where I lay flat on my face in a hollow within 6 feet of the track that led to the pavilion. Thence, I should have the satisfaction of recognizing the arrivals, and, if they should prove to be acquaintances, greeting them as soon as they landed. Some time before 11, while the tide was still dangerously low, a boat's lantern appeared close in shore, and, my attention being thus awakened, I could perceive another still far to seaward, violently tossed, and sometimes hidden by the billows. The weather, which was getting dirtier as the night went on, and the perilous situation of the yacht upon a lee shore, had probably driven them to attempt a landing at the earliest possible moment. A little afterwards, 4 yachtsmen carrying a very heavy chest, and guided by a 5th with a lantern, passed close in front of me as I lay, and were admitted to the pavilion by the nurse. They returned to the beach, and passed me a 3rd time with another chest larger but apparently not so heavy as the first. A 3rd time they made the transit, and on this occasion one of the yachtsmen carried a leather portmanteau, and the others a lady's trunk and carriage bag. My curiosity was sharply excited. If a woman were among the guests of Northmore, it would show a change in his habits, and an apostasy from his pet theories of life well calculated to fill me with surprise. When he and I dwelt there together, the Pavilion had been a temple of misogyny. And now, one of the detested sex was to be installed under its roof. I remembered one or two particulars, a few notes of daintiness and almost of coquetry which had struck me the day before as I surveyed the preparations in the house. Their purpose was now clear, and I thought myself dull not to have perceived it from the first. While I was thus reflecting, a second lantern drew near me from the beach. It was carried by a yachtsman whom I had not yet seen, and who was conducting 2 other persons to the pavilion. These 2 persons were unquestionably the guests for whom the house was made ready, and, straining eye and ear, I set myself to watch them as they passed. One was an unusually tall man, in a travelling hat slouched over his eyes, and a Highland cape closely buttoned and turned up so as to conceal his face. You could make out no more of him than that he was, as I have said, unusually tall, and walked feebly with a heavy stoop. By his side, and either clinging to him or giving him support, I could not make out which, was a young, tall, and slender figure of a woman. She was extremely pale, but in the light of the lantern her face was so marred by strong and changing shadows that she might equally well have been as ugly as sin or as beautiful as I afterwards found her to be. When they were just abreast of me, the girl made some remark which was drowned by the noise of the wind. "Hush," said her companion, and there was something in the tone with which the word was uttered that thrilled and rather shook my spirits. It seemed to breathe from a bosom labouring under the deadliest terror. I have never heard another syllable so expressive, and I still hear it again when I am feverish at night, and my mind runs upon old times. The man turned toward the girl as he spoke. I had a glimpse of much red beard and a nose which seemed to have been broken in youth, and his light eyes seemed shining in his face with some strong and unpleasant emotion. But these 2 passed on and were admitted in their turn to the pavilion. One by one, or in groups, the seamen returned to the beach. The wind brought me the sound of a rough voice crying, "Shove off." Then, after a pause, another lantern drew near. It was Northmore alone. My wife and I, a man and a woman, have often agreed to wonder how a person could be, at the same time, so handsome and so repulsive as Northmore. He had the appearance of a finished gentleman, his face bore every mark of intelligence and courage, but you had only to look at him, even in his most amiable moment, to see that he had the temper of a slaver captain. I never knew a character that was both explosive and revengeful to the same degree. He combined the vivacity of the South with the sustained and deadly hatreds of the North, and both traits were plainly written on his face, which was a sort of danger signal. In person, he was tall, strong, and active, his hair and complexion very dark, his features handsomely designed, but spoiled by a menacing expression. At that moment he was somewhat paler than by nature, he wore a heavy frown, and his lips worked, and he looked sharply round him as he walked, like a man besieged with apprehensions. And yet I thought he had a look of triumph underlying all, as though he had already done much, and was near the end of an achievement. Partly from a scruple of delicacy, which I dare say came too late, partly from the pleasure of startling an acquaintance, I desired to make my presence known to him without delay. I got suddenly to my feet, and stepped forward. "Northmore," said I. "I have never had so shocking a surprise in all my days." He leaped on me without a word, something shone in his hand, and he struck for my heart with a dagger. At the same moment I knocked him head over heels. Whether it was my quickness, or his own uncertainty, I know not, but the blade only grazed my shoulder, while the hilt and his fist struck me violently on the mouth. I fled, but not far. I had often and often observed the capabilities of the sand hills for protracted ambush or stealthy advances and retreats, and, not 10 yards from the scene of the scuffle, plumped down again upon the grass. The lantern had fallen and gone out. But what was my astonishment to see Northmore slip at a bound into the pavilion, and hear him bar the door behind him with a clang of iron. He had not pursued me. He had run away. Northmore, whom I knew for the most implacable and daring of men, had run away. I could scarce believe my reason, and yet in this strange business, where all was incredible, there was nothing to make a work about in an incredibility more or less. For why was the pavilion secretly prepared? Why had Northmour landed with his guests at dead of night, in half a gale of wind, and with the floe scarce covered? Why had he sought to kill me? Had he not recognized my voice? I wondered. And, above all, how had he come to have a dagger ready in his hand? A dagger, or even a sharp knife, seemed out of keeping with the age in which we live, and a gentleman landing from his yacht on the shore of his own estate, even although it was at night and with some mysterious circumstances, does not usually, as a matter of fact, walk thus prepared for deadly onslaught. The more I reflected, the further I felt at sea. I recapitulated the elements of mystery, counting them on my fingers. The pavilion secretly prepared for guests. The guests landed at the risk of their lives and to the imminent peril of the yacht. The guests, or at least one of them, in undisguised and seemingly causeless terror. Northmour with a naked weapon. Northmour stabbing his most intimate acquaintance at a word. Last, and not least strange, Northmour fleeing from the man whom he had sought to murder, and barricading himself, like a hunted creature, behind the door of the pavilion. Here were at least 6 separate causes for extreme surprise, each part and parcel with the others, and forming altogether one consistent story. I felt almost ashamed to believe my own senses. As I thus stood transfixed with wonder, I began to grow painfully conscious of the injuries I had received in the scuffle, skulked round among the sand hills, and, by a devious path, regained the shelter of the wood. On the way, the old nurse passed again within several yards of me, still carrying her lantern, on the return journey to the mansion house of Graydon. This made a 7th suspicious feature in the case. Northmour and his guests, it appeared, were to cook and do the cleaning for themselves, while the old woman continued to inhabit the big empty barrack among the policies. There must surely be great cause for secrecy, when so many inconveniences were confronted to preserve it. So thinking, I made my way to the den. For greater security, I trod out the embers of the fire, and lighted my lantern to examine the wound upon my shoulder. It was a trifling hurt, although it bled somewhat freely, and I dressed it as well as I could, for its position made it difficult to reach with some rag and cold water from the spring. While I was thus busied, I mentally declared war against Northmour and his mystery. I am not an angry man by nature, and I believe there was more curiosity than resentment in my heart. But war one certainly declared, and, by way of preparation, I got out my revolver, and, having drawn the charges, cleaned and reloaded it with scrupulous care. Next I became preoccupied about my horse. It might break loose, or fall to neighing, and so betray my camp in the sea wood. I determined to rid myself of its neighborhood, and long before dawn I was leading it over the links in the direction of the fisher village.